Hi, this is Miss Klemme and welcome to the video on heart anatomy and circulation paths. What we're looking at here is the circulatory system. It's a pretty simplified drawing, but the important thing is if we look at any type of individual, any type of animal, they all have three things that help to identify its circulatory system. The first thing it has is some sort of fluid. In the case of humans, we call that fluid blood, but not all organisms have blood. They have something else called hemolymph. The second thing all organisms have in their circulatory system is some sort of vessel system to get the fluid all around the body. And the third thing that all circulatory systems have is some sort of pump. And in humans, that pump is our heart. In fact, you guys probably know this, it's roughly the size of our fist. Now if you look at this really watered down schematic, we have our pumping organ at the middle here. This is a vessel that's carrying away from the heart, so we classify that as an artery. And then that artery gets kind of subdivided into smaller and smaller vessels until we get down to the nitty-gritty called the capillaries. And that's where all the good stuff is exchanged, dropped off to our body cells, the waste is picked up, but eventually those all gather together back to go towards the heart, and if it's going toward the heart, we call it a vein. And so in a nutshell, this is our circulatory system, and that's how it's organized. But let's spend a little more time really just focusing on the heart. Now if you take a look at this, you might think, well, the blue side, that would be the left side, and the red side looks like the right side. But make sure that you're viewing this heart in anatomical position, as if this heart, if you would grab it out of that page and put it into where your heart currently is. So in fact, if you do that, well, I don't suggest that you do that, but if you pretend, the right side is actually going to be the blue side over here. And then the left side of your heart will be the red side. Now let me point out a couple of things on this diagram before we get into the major details. First of all is this: the heart is surrounded by a protective sac that's filled with a little bit of fluid. And that sac is called the pericardium. It just helps to cushion it, reduce friction because it's constantly beating and moving. And so if you ever have open heart surgery, the surgeon actually has to cut through the pericardium to get to the heart. The second thing here that divides the heart is what's called the septum. This is a wall that divides the left and right halves of the heart. The septum is pretty important when we look at the heart from an evolutionary perspective, because it really does a great job of keeping the right side separate from the left. And that's important because the right side has oxygen-poor blood, and the left side has oxygen-rich blood. So we can keep those two types separate, and so thus increasing the efficiency of the heart. And then the last thing is pretty much what makes up the heart. It's all around the outside here, is the heart muscle itself. It's called the myocardium. So that's kind of an overview of how the heart is organized. Now let's just for a second erase what we've started with. Let's start with a clean slate. Now again, just to remember, this is the right side, and the red side is oxygen rich, or excuse me, the left side is oxygen rich over here. Now let's actually trace some blood through the heart so you get to understand the pathway that blood has to take to get to both sides of the heart. So first of all, we have to enter the right side first. And blood can enter from above or from below, but those are both called vena cavas. This is the inferior vena cava coming from below, and this is the superior vena cava coming from above. And they will both drain blood into the first upper chamber called the right atrium. Atrium always receives blood, it's on the top. Blood is then going to go through these little doorways. Those doorways are called valves. We'll talk more about them later. This valve in particular is called an AV valve, an atrioventricular valve, and that's because it separates the atrium from the right ventricle. The ventricles are the lower chambers. They provide pressure to push blood out to other parts of the body. And then blood will go through the second set of valves, and those valves are called the semilunar valves. And this particular semilunar valve is going to open into an artery because blood is traveling away. In this case, it's traveling to the lungs. We call it the pulmonary artery. So blood is going to travel out. It's going to go to the left lung. It's going to go to the right lung. It's going to pick up a fresh batch of oxygen. And it's going to come back to the heart. And how do we come back to the heart? We come back to the heart via veins. And these are the only veins in your body that are actually oxygen rich. These are pulmonary veins that drain into the left atrium, going through the AV valves into the most powerful ventricle of the two, the left ventricle. You can see the myocardium is much thicker over here because the left ventricle has to supply enough force and pressure onto that blood so that there's enough left to flow to the very top of your head and to the very tips of your toes. And that blood under extremely high pressure is going to go through this next semilunar valve and through up onto the aorta. It's the largest artery in your body. And that aorta quickly subdivides and gets blood. It goes down below here as well. It gets blood everywhere all over your body so that it can drop off the nutrients that all your cells need to stay alive. Now what I want to do is erase these again, and let's take a closer look at those valves. I said the ones that separate the atrium from the ventricle, those are the AV valves. In particular, this one over here is given a name of tricuspid valve. And I always remember tricuspid because it has an R in it for the right side. That tricuspid valve opens as blood flows in, and then it closes so that blood can't seep backwards. And that's a good thing. It means your heart is working properly. Now the other AV valve over here, very similar in name, is called the bicuspid valve. You may also hear it in some books or read about it, called the mitral valve. The other category of valves are the semilunar valves, and there are two. This one right here, right before the pulmonary artery, is the pulmonary semilunar valve, and the one below it over here is the aortic semilunar valve, which leads to the aorta. Now, I had started to mention the good part about valves is that they close so blood can't seep backwards. And that's great. In fact, they're even bolted down to the wall of the heart with extra support here with these little fibers. And those fibers are called chordae tendineae. So when a doctor is listening to your heartbeat, he's actually listening to two sounds. He's listening to a loped up, loped up, loped up. That first sound is actually your AV valves closing, and the second sound is the blood recoiling as the SL valves close. But if he hears a little bit of hissing after the initial sound, that's telling the doctor that something's not quite sealing right with those valves, and you may have what's called a heart murmur. So you may go your whole life with a small heart murmur, and that's just fine. But if the heart murmur is significant enough and enough blood is leaking backwards, you'll have to actually go in and get a valve replacement. Otherwise, your heart's just not working as efficient as it could. So that's a closer look at the heart valves. Now, I really want to make sure that you have this pathway down. So if you need to, take a moment and pause the video. Go back, and can you trace a drop of blood from the vena cavas all the way through your aorta? Now I have this little acronym that I always talk about here, VAVA L, VAVA B. And so I color-coded, and this is kind of the pattern here. We have blood goes through the vena cava, the atrium, the ventricle, the artery, then it hits the lungs. You notice it becomes oxygenated, and then it does that same pattern again, but delivers that blood all over your body. So perhaps you may find that acronym helpful for you as you're trying to study the pathway of blood flow. Now we're not quite finished. I want to give you the whole big picture of what this looks like. We really just focused in on the heart and the pathway of blood through the heart, but blood goes all over your body. So let's take a look at 3 different circulation paths here. The first one that we have is pulmonary circulation, and I kind of mentioned that with the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. It's basically the route from your heart to your lungs and back. But then once it comes back to your heart, it's on the left side and gets pumped all over your body. It goes up to your upper extremities and to your lower extremities. So we call that systemic circulation. Now there's one final pathway that a lot of folks forget about, and that's the fact that the heart is a muscle itself and it needs oxygen and nutrients just like any other cell in your body. So there's a branch of your aorta that's just dedicated to coming off your aorta and supplying your heart muscle itself with blood, and that's called the coronary circulation path. Now as we wrap things up here about the heart and anatomy and how it functions, I want to take just a close look here at the pressure in the cardiac cycle that happens every time your heart beats. So the first part of that cardiac cycle is the contraction part. It's called systole, and this is when your ventricles are pumping the blood out, both your left and right. When your heart is relaxing and filling with blood in your atria, that's called diastole. Now, that's one complete cardiac cycle. So if you go to your local Walmart or Walgreens, or heaven forbid your doctor, they're going to take your blood pressure there. And what they're actually measuring are both components of the cardiac cycle. They're measuring the pressure when your ventricles are contracting over when they're relaxing. Systolic over diastolic pressure. So they're looking at what is the peak pressure that your heart is under when it's pumping, and what is the lowest pressure it's under when it's filling. And a good ballpark range for healthy individuals is about 110 over 70. Now one final thing. Say after years of high blood pressure, of hypertension, the diastolic over systolic, or smoking, or lack of exercise, or poor diet, sometimes that can lead to something called congestive heart failure. And you'll notice in this picture, I know it's kind of small right now, but the myocardium has gotten really, really, really big. And that's what happens in congestive heart failure. But let me show you this cycle of how this begins and how it gets worse. So first of all of those factors, the high blood pressure, the poor diet, the low exercise, the smoking, can all lead to the heart really failing to pump blood effectively. And so what does the heart do? It wants to be better. So over time, that left ventricle, which has to pump to the whole entire body, says, I gotta get bigger, I gotta get stronger, I gotta do this. So it tries to build up more and more muscle, but in the end, the heart just gets more big, and it really becomes more and more inefficient than even before. So it's this never-ending cycle, this cascade, that eventually leads to a lack of pumping because that muscle has just gotten too big. So that's a look at basic heart anatomy and blood flow. Thanks for listening.